A lot of people joining from across the world today, so do say hello in the chat. Introduce yourself and let us know where you are dialing in from. If you'd like to share a question that you hope to be addressed or the reason why you joined today's session, that would be great as well. My name is Srinitya Nagarajan. I'm a Policy Engagement and Comms Associate with the Government Outcomes Lab. And together with Mara Hairoldi, the Academic Director of the Government Outcomes Lab will be hosting today's session. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers joining us today to discuss the findings of the third wave of the independent evaluation of the FCDO Development Impact Bonds pilot program. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's a really exciting evaluation and set of findings from the report. So we are joined by James Chronicle, one of the authors of the report, and we're also joined by leading experts from FCDO, Village Enterprise, Education Outcomes Fund, and Bridges Outcomes Partnership. So in today's session, we'll be exploring the findings of the evaluation, particularly about the effect of the DIB, the funding mechanism. So for next slide, please. For those of you who are new to Government Outcomes Lab, we are a policy and research center based in the University of Oxford. So we were created in 2016 in partnership with UK government and the university. Our mission is to really enable governments around the world to foster effective partnerships with private sector, voluntary sector, and civil society. So we do so by conducting independent research on outcome-based partnerships, but also we curate a range of resources, including open data sets and various knowledge products. So a really important part of our work is to ensure that the insights that are generated by us and everyone else around the world is used in policy and practice. So we do a lot of engagement events and capacity building activities, and including this Engaging with Evidence series. Next slide, please. Thank you. Launched back in 2021, the Engaging with Evidence series are really grounded in research, but we want to facilitate open discussion and look at practical consideration for those working on the ground. So it's really a platform for all policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to come together and engage with the latest work in the field. So if you want to keep up to date with all the engagement events coming up, I encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter. And Eve just dropped the link to sign up, so please do. Next slide, please. So coming to today's session, so we are going to follow similar structure to previous session, starting with a very short presentation, followed by a panel discussion. So firstly, we'll be hearing from Jemima Atkinson from FCDO. Jemima will be setting the context and will be giving us an overview of FCDO DIBs pilot program. Then we'll hear from James Chronicle, one of the authors of the evaluation, who will share the insights and key learnings from the evaluation. So, and then we'll be circling back to Jemima, who will be sharing how FCDO have been using the findings of evaluation in their own work. So for second part of the discussion, Mara will be moderating a discussion with our wonderful panel of speakers. So during the panel discussion, we'll be exploring several different themes, including the value added by using a development impact bond model, the role of various stakeholders, collaboration and peer learning between stakeholders, and also sustainability and system strengthening effects of the programs. So in the next slide, again, another reminder is we really like to keep the sessions interactive. So do say hello in the chat. Please share any reflections, comments, and any thoughts throughout the session. So if you like to raise your hand on Zoom when we have the Q&A session, part of the session, please do so and we'll come to you, and do feel free to get involved. People also enjoy the networking element that comes with these events and the chat. So do connect with others in the chat. So you may already had the recording permission pop-up come up. So if we'll be recording the session, and the session recording will be available on our events page. So you can kind of watch it again and have a refresh of the session. So one final reminder is to stay muted when others are speaking. So I think I've got all the housekeeping out of the way. So, and we have a very great discussion coming up. So I'll hand over to our first presenter, Jemima. If you'd like to introduce yourself first and dive into the presentation, that would be great. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Shri. And hi, everyone. Great to see such a good turnout and excited for a good discussion. My name's Jemima Hodkinson, and I'm the Senior Advisor in the Impact Investing team in the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which is where this work is being led from. Next slide, please. And the next one. Brilliant. So I'll start by explaining some of the context to the FCDO's Development Impact Bonds pilot programme. And just a side note first, this work began in the Department for International Development, also known as DFID for short. In 2020, DFID merged with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is the UK's Foreign Ministry, to become the FCDO. So I'll refer to both throughout, but just to explain that first to avoid any confusion. So the story began in around 2014 when DFID developed a strategy for applying payment by results mechanisms in development programs, aiming to improve program performance by incentivizing partners, by improving accountability, and enabling more adaptive management. And payment by results at this stage was defined as any program where donors pay after the achievement of pre-agreed results, and those could have been output or outcome level. But one challenge with this approach, and this was recognized in that original strategy in 2014, was that clearly not all implementing organizations would be able to take on the risk entailed by a traditional payment by results contract. So in 2017, DFID launched the first pilot of development impact bonds, really thinking of those as an alternative way of applying payment by results that would help to overcome that challenge that I just mentioned. I won't go into details of what an impact bond is because I think James is going to touch on that in his presentation. But if you could click to the next slide. Thank you. I'll explain a bit more context. So 2017, this was very early days for development impact bonds generally. I think only 2 had been implemented previously at this time, although social impact bonds had been used fairly extensively in the UK by this point, and we did draw on this learning as we developed the business case for the DIBs pilot. But given how new the mechanism was, our objectives with the pilot were really to build evidence on the suitability and on the cost effectiveness of the development impact bond as a tool for financing international development programs. So we selected 3 different pilot projects covering a real range of sectors, countries, partners, and that was intentional. And we also invested really heavily in evaluation at the same time. Again, I won't go into detail now on exactly what each of the pilots was because James will explain that. But I will say a word about what we were hoping to get out of the evaluation. So we wanted this evaluation to help us understand what are the enabling conditions for impact bonds to deliver good value for money, rather than a crude binary assessment of whether they're suitable or not. So we wanted the evaluation to consider the role that the model itself played in driving program performance and results. We wanted to learn about where the model might be more appropriate and where it might be less appropriate to use. And we wanted to learn more about the cost effectiveness of the model and whether there were things that we could do to improve its cost effectiveness. So I'll stop there on the context and I'll pass over to James to explain more about the program and what the evaluation found.
Thank you very much, Jemima, and thank you in particular to the GoLab for hosting this session. It's a fantastic opportunity to, well, for us to share some of our findings and for others to hear and discuss them as well. As Jemima said, I'll pick up the mantle of setting the scene and explaining a little bit more about what a development impact bond is, the 3 DIBs that within this program, and the sort of focus and the method for the evaluation before I move on to discuss some of the findings. So if we could move on to the next slide and the next one, please. Thank you. As Jemima might have said, FCDO were involved in 3 of the development impact bonds, and they're summarized here. We had the ICRC Humanitarian Impact Bond that was focusing on the construction of physical rehabilitation centres in 3 countries within Africa. The Quality Education India DIB that was building on the Educate Girls DIB that you may be familiar with, focused on improving education outcomes for primary school age children in India. And finally, the Village Enterprise DIB, and we're joined, and we'll hear from Celeste later on the panel, who's from Village Enterprise, focused on poverty graduation for the extreme poor within Kenya and Africa. So quite different impact bonds, different scales, different people they were working with, and different geographies as well. Although, as I said, they did have one thing in common, which is that they were all funded through development impact bonds. And so the focus of our evaluation wasn't necessarily on the effectiveness of these 3 interventions, but rather the effectiveness of the impact bond and how it affected the delivery and impact of these 3 interventions. The next slide just says a little bit about what an impact bond is. As Jemima said, it fits within the context of a payment by results program where the donor is paying for the outcomes that are achieved. But where a DIB differs from a traditional payment by results is in a payment by results program, usually it's the implementers or the service providers that have to take on that financial risk. They need to fund the service, and they only get the funding back when those outcomes are achieved. And as Jemima said, that creates some challenges because it means that only large-scale or well-resourced organizations can be involved in these types of contracts, which inhibits the ability for smaller NGOs or people with less financial resources, perhaps where some more of the social innovation exists, to be involved. And the difference, therefore, between this and a typical payment by results is that an investor is involved who provides that upfront capital to the service provider, and they take on all or some of the financial risk should the service fail, but they also receive usually a return if the service is successful. The next slide just provides one example of this within the program. This is the Village Enterprise program. So here we had 9 investors providing 3.25 million in working capital that flowed through to the service provider, which was Village Enterprise. They were able to use that capital to launch their service, in which they were supporting 12,600 of the extreme poor in Kenya and Uganda, focusing on poverty graduation, increasing consumption, and increasing assets as well. The results of their program were measured through a randomized control trial. So you had villages receiving support from Village Enterprise and control villages that were not. And you had ID Insight undertaking a survey across those villages to look at differences in consumption and assets. And the outcome payers paid $1 to Village Enterprise for every dollar that the results showed to be an increase in consumption. And that was used to repay the original $3 million loan. Next slide, please. As I said, the evaluation was really focusing on what we call the DIB effect. So how did the fact that these 3 services were funded through a DIB, how did it affect the design, delivery, performance, and effectiveness of these interventions? But also there was a learning focus on the evaluation as well, trying to look at what improvements could be made for designing and agreeing impact bonds in order to enhance their benefits, but also ideally to reduce the associated transaction costs as well. On the next slide, just talk a little bit about the approach that we did. This was primarily a qualitative piece of research. We attempted to do a cost effectiveness analysis to look at quantify the additional impacts and costs of some of the impact bonds, but that the results of that proved to be insignificant. There's quite a detailed technical annex for those that are interested to know more, but we weren't able to include it in the conclusions. So we predominantly focused on interviews with stakeholders, reviewing key documents, and analysing the cost data across the impact bonds, and also monitoring data as well. in trying to capture and measure and look at the DIB effect, what we did was we developed a DIB theory of change. So what were the hypothesized effects that we might expect to see coming out of previous literature, speaking to stakeholders and based on our previous experience as well. And then we created a set of qualitative indicators to try and look at, well, what would that look like? And are we seeing it in these impact bonds? What appear to be the driving forces that are resulting in that? Is it the impact bond, or is it other mechanisms or processes as well? But we also identified a set of comparator sites, so similar interventions in similar places funded not through DIBs, so we could try and compare what delivery and effectiveness looked like in the DIB in those DIB funded projects with non-DIB funded, to try and help us really tease out where the DIB effect really lay. We move on, please. Thank you. So in terms of some of the key findings, I'll talk first about what our findings were in terms of the DIB effect, and then I'll talk about the costs and some of the learning that we identified as well. If you move on to the next slide, firstly, in terms of the social and financial performance of the impact bonds, they all ended in more or less a way, both in terms of the social outcomes and also the financial returns, in a way that was modeled and that people were hoping for. So the ICRC Humanitarian Impact Bond led to a 9% improvement in staff efficiency. The participating schools in the Quality Education India DIB achieved 2.5 times more learning outcomes than non-participating schools. And the RCT showed around a 5 to 6% difference in consumption and assets in the RCT between the intervention and the control sites, leading to broadly the amount of outcome payments that people were hoping for, and also around the level of returns. So in terms of the outcomes achieved and the returns that were achieved, these projects could be seen as a success. What that doesn't necessarily tell you is that just tells you how successful the intervention was. It doesn't necessarily tell you whether the impact bond is the reason for why that happened, or what difference the impact bond made. And that's what we'll hopefully try and unpick in the next few slides. So if we move on. I won't spend too much time on this slide. This is covered in quite a lot of detail in the report, but this is just to show you these are the different hypothesized effects that we were looking to test, both in the design and the delivery of the interventions, and also in the spillover and sort of the wider legacy. And we WAG rated these. As you could see, we had to sort of blend the colors because they got harder and harder to choose just between 3 different colors. But we WAG rated them based on the extent to which we could see them and the extent to which we were confident that that was attributable to predominantly to the impact bond mechanism rather than something else. The red doesn't mean a negative, it means an absence of what the effect was. You can very quickly cast your eye down this, and I think what's quite interesting is you can see that quite a lot of the effects that were supposed to be there at the design stage, so transferring of risk and enabling other smaller service providers to be involved in PBR, they're coming out quite strong. They were quite green. The effects in terms of the positive effects are pretty much there. They're sort of green-amber because the DIB did lead to some of these effects, but it was also other things as well. The negative effects we generally didn't see. There's a little bit we saw around lowering of staff morale because of the heightened pressure, but the other risks that you often see or could see with PBR around cherry picking and other aspects, we didn't pick up across these impact bonds. And the spillover effects are generally quite positive as well in terms of the green. But what does that actually mean? What does that tell us? What is the impact bond doing in these different projects? And this infographic here attempts to kind of summarize and draw together all of that detail that was in the last slide. So what we see is that the DIB seems to change things at all different stages. So at the design, the delivery, but also in terms of the legacy of the programs as well. So we did see that outcome funders were more comfortable in funding riskier projects or projects they weren't as confident would be particularly necessarily successful. We did see a range of service providers able to participate in payment by results programs who hadn't been able to historically. And in terms of looking at the delivery, we saw the impact bond kind of lead to 4 different effects within it. It led to a stronger focus on outcomes. There was a clearer articulation of what those outcomes were. People had a better understanding of how they were being measured and had kind of real-time data to be able to see what the outcomes were being achieved and be able to react accordingly. You saw heightened performance management. So a number of these specific performance managers were brought in as different organizations to work closely with the service providers and sort of more regular analysis and diving into the performance of the programs. You saw a wider set of external perspectives and expertise, more people around the table, essentially, to discuss and look at the programs in terms of the intermediaries, the investors. And you also had a high stakes environment. The success or otherwise of these programs became a bigger deal because they were being measured, because payments were being attached to them, and also a bit of a spotlight. DIBs, as Jemima said, were quite new, and the international community was very interested in them. So everybody was quite aware that people were going to be really following these programs. What that led to was generally greater collaboration. We can unpick that a bit, but generally greater collaboration between everybody. A stronger course correction. People knew what outcomes were happening, and they had that pressure from that high stakes environment to change things. And we generally saw, although it's hard, as I said, to conclude this quantitatively, but we generally saw increased numbers supported and better outcomes achieved. But it's also interesting to highlight that generally this effect seemed to differ across these three impact bonds. We also looked at a fourth one that wasn't funded by FCDO, the cataract bond. We generally saw these findings were stronger and more evident in the Village Enterprise and the Quality Education India impact bond than we did in the humanitarian impact bond and the Cameroon Cataract Hospital, which is the fourth one we looked at. Our general belief as to why that was the case is because the ICRC had very well-established mechanisms, a very well-established program. In reality, the ability of a small impact bond relative to the size of the physical rehabilitation program, it just wasn't necessary. It wasn't really an intention in order to change those processes. So that faster course correction and adaptation, you didn't really see in that. Equally, in the hospital, we did see some of these effects, but the DIB was a very small proportion of the payments that the hospital were receiving. So the high stakes environment and the implications were less strong. And that leads us on to the next slide, please. Actually, I'm going to skip over that because I'm probably running out of time. There's some quotes in here that just provide more evidence that you can read in your own time. But if we skip over to the next slide, it leads us to reflect a bit on, based on what we saw and what the DIB effect is, based on the degree to which it seemed to differ across those four projects, what does that tell us about where it might be most appropriate? And our main conclusion as to what an impact bond is and what it achieves is really it's a change management tool. It creates the impetus and also the mechanisms to focus much more on outcomes and delivery and adapt as a result. And therefore, if you see that as the main benefit of what they bring, we think they're most appropriate in the context where you think performance could be better. So where you're seeing low outcomes and you think that if things were done differently, you maybe could get more outcomes. Where the system or culture needs some sort of external disruption to bring about change. When we describe the benefits of impact bonds, people say, yeah, but you could just do that anyway. And we say, yes, but people don't. Like there is something, the system is stuck. So where the system is stuck, this can bring about that disruption. Where, as Jemima said, service providers would not be able to tolerate high levels of financial risk, and where also you think that providers would benefit from external expertise and support. We move on to the next slide. This covers the costs of the impact bonds and the additional costs that came about through the impact bond mechanism. We generally found that in order to do this, we asked the projects to provide us with the breakdown of the costs and an estimate of where they think those costs were because attributable specifically to the impact bond and wouldn't have existed without the impact bond. Where we could, we cross-referenced that with our comparator sites where we had the sort of non-impact bond projects. We generally found that the impact bond did increase the costs of running the programs. It varied across the different impact bonds, but it was between 1.8 and $2.3 million, which was between 9 and 42% of the total program budget for these different impact bonds. Where those costs generally fell was in the return to the investors, the verification costs, particularly where that was external verification, and also in the performance management costs as well. Trying to ascertain whether this is value for money, it was incredibly difficult to do with the absence of very accurate quantitative comparisons. As I say, we tried to do cost effectiveness analysis and it proved insignificant. So in order to try and ascertain whether you could say this was value for money, we firstly looked at, well, where are the additional costs and where are the additional benefits? And is there an alignment between the two? And we generally found that there was. So those costs of bringing in the investor, the verification and performance management costs, they were the things in the impact bonds that were driving the benefits. So you are buying extra stuff that is getting you buying extra benefits. And we also scoped out and discussed these costs with the people involved in the programs, whether they were comfortable with these costs and whether they felt that these were value for money. And people generally felt that they were. If we move on, in terms of some of the lessons that we think we'll learn around this, there's quite a few here, so I won't delve into all of them. But I think one of the key things that we found was that whilst one of the benefits, as we said, of the impact bond is you have more people around the table, you've got more expertise, more ideas. At times that was also made things very difficult. And it didn't necessarily streamline decision making. It wasn't always clear who decision makers were at different points. It made communication quite cumbersome, and that at times made things challenging, particularly with COVID, where you needed fast decisions around fast responses. Some of the impact bonds struggled with that. There are particular things that we think were particularly valuable, and so in designing future impact bonds should really be prioritized, and that was around the performance management and the additional scrutiny on outcomes that came out. That was something that was particularly valuable. There were some lessons learned around the sort of black box approach to impact bonds, that the general belief is that an impact bond should just stipulate outcomes. That's the only role of the donor, and then essentially get out of the way and let service providers and others work out the best way to achieve those outcomes. That's generally seen as the approach, and it's generally seen as beneficial, but there was also lessons learned around the need to be expectations around minimum standards, particularly when working with vulnerable groups. There needs to be particular elements of due diligence as well. So generally a black box approach, but not a complete carte blanche. There also needs to be some focus around that as well. If we move on to the next slide, this offers some reflections from us on what next, and what does this mean for the development sector? What does this mean for development impact bonds? I mean, it'd be very interesting to hear how the panel reacts, but our the general reflections on the stakeholders that we interviewed on the being involved in these pilots was that they were really positive about the benefits that they saw through the impact bond, and they were really interested in looking at outcomes-based models again. But most people felt they wouldn't necessarily do it in the same way that they did. They wouldn't necessarily do it in a development impact bond, and they probably wouldn't do it in the development impact bonds that we saw in these pilots. And that's because of the reasons that I just said around some of the challenges of decision making, of it feeling at times quite cumbersome and quite complicated. And so the key question, I think, in terms of what next, I think our conclusion is that these impact bonds did bring additional benefits. They did bring additional outcomes. But can you tease out the benefits that you saw in a different way? Can you streamline this in order to get those and reduce some of the costs or some of the cumbersome elements of it? And here are some ideas that we had. Some of these quite well established, some of these less so. The first one, I think most people have already reached this conclusion, is that outcome funds are a particular way of doing this. When we looked at the costs, what we found was that the costs did not rise, the additional DIB costs, they did not rise in proportion to the size of the DIBs. As a proportion of the total DIBs, they got smaller. And so the larger that you do the impact bonds, the less as a proportion of the budget the costs are. We also found that most of those costs were at the design stage, except for those where you had high external verification costs. Generally, the cost of delivery were about the same, but large amounts of costs went into the design. And therefore, that also suggests that outcomes funds where you design an impact bond once and implement it in multiple sites can also be a more efficient way of doing outcomes-based contracts. We've seen in many different ways, often a very specific stipulation around what outcomes-based contract people want. They want impact bonds, they want something else. And that generally leads to not always the right mechanism being used in the right place. So taking, as the designers, a more kind of model agnostic approach. So stipulating what the outcomes and payments are, but letting the market work out, should that be a DIB, should that be payment by results, would be a better way, we think, of doing it. And also there's a lot of discussions around scale and how do you scale outcomes-based contracts? And what we found was that, and maybe the panel can discuss this more, that the longer-term spillover effects of the impact bonds was very strong, that they led to that change management, they led to processes being embedded within those organizations. And we revisited some of those organizations 2 years after the impact bond had ended, and we saw those innovations that were there in the impact bond still there, and they had been rolled out across the organization. And so perhaps if we're talking about scaling, you don't necessarily need to do a really large impact bond. You could do a small impact bond, which is that disruption, which builds the capacity of the service providers. And then those service providers that are the most promising in the impact bond, you scale up their interventions on the assumption that the things they've introduced to the impact bond, they then continue to use as well. Just the final slide then is the conclusion of this. So to conclude, I mean, we found that the DIB pilot programs were successful in meeting the aims and objectives of the program around testing a new funding mechanism, about building stronger relationships with the private sector, and around galvanizing service providers as well. We found that the strongest DIB effects was in relation to embedding an outcomes focus within all the different organizations in the impact bonds and introducing performance management systems. That therefore the DIB can be seen as a change management tool that is best applicable when you've got a context where outcomes could be stronger and disruption is required to bring about change. While stakeholders were broadly positive of the benefits and the value for money of the DIB mechanism, most felt that you could maybe streamline it and do it in a more effective manner. And therefore, I think the key question for us all to consider in the future is, can you achieve an outcomes focus and a high stakes environment through a simpler structure? And that I do not have the answer to. That requires another pilot and another evaluation, but hopefully that's something that we can all debate in the rest of this session. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'll pass the floor now to Jemima to talk us through how FCDO have been using these findings of the evaluation in their work. Over to you, Jemima.
Brilliant, thank you. If you could click to the next slide, please. Thanks. So if you can cast your mind back to the timeline that I showed at the start, that showed that just 2 years after we launched the DIBs pilot, we actually started our follow-on program, the Pioneer Outcomes Fund, which aimed to continue to test the DIBs model, but in a way that learned from the evidence that was emerging from the DIBs pilot. So the first thing to say is that even the first cycle of the DIBs evaluation provided enough evidence for us to develop that business case for the Pioneer Outcomes Fund. We felt that we knew enough at that stage to justify further testing. And then the way that we designed this follow-on program took into account some of the key learnings that James has just been explaining. So I'll go into a bit more detail about some of those. Firstly, using an outcomes fund approach rather than a project level DIB. As James said, we'd found from the DIBs that the additional costs perhaps didn't necessarily scale in line with the total project value, pointing to outcomes funds potentially being a more efficient way of delivering this type of project. So outcomes funds where you pool funds from donors and from investors and can then enter into several outcomes contracts. And that's what we're doing in the Pioneer Outcomes Fund. So we are participating as an outcomes funder in 2 education outcomes funds in Sierra Leone and Ghana. So that's cost effectiveness, economies of scale. And then secondly, James spoke about how the DIBs pilot did see a strong effect in relation to embedding an outcomes focus within a project. But also we saw that outcome verification does carry additional cost. So that's something that we've really focused on in these 2 education outcomes fund programs. We've used a relatively small number of indicators. We've spent time and really spent a lot of time and resource making sure that we are setting the outcome targets at the right level and that they're priced appropriately. And those programs also use a blend of activity and outcome-based payments. And also the methods of verifying outcomes, we've used some experimental methods, but not exclusively. And also it's an area that in our ongoing program management, we now put greater emphasis on really monitoring and making sure that the quality of outcome verification is at the right level. And then finally, this is a slightly tangential point, but the DIBs evaluation did make us reflect on the role that we might be able to play in developing the wider ecosystem around these models, not to promote the mechanism indiscriminately, but to support other actors to adopt an outcomes focus and to be able to think through creatively which elements of the model are most appropriate in any given context. And we've been doing that in a number of ways since, which I can go into more detail later if people are interested. If you could click to the next slide. This is my last slide. So our Pioneer Outcomes Fund is ongoing, but we're now also turning our attention internally onto how we can support teams around the FCDO to apply outcomes-based approaches where they're relevant. And the results and the case studies from the DIBs evaluation is going to be really important for us in this, important for us to use those results to help other teams to understand what these mechanisms are, understand where all of the points that we've been talking about where they can add value and where other mechanisms may be more appropriate. And really at the forefront of our minds as we're doing that internal capability building is the evaluation finding that a model agnostic approach is key here. So we want teams to think about the outcomes they're trying to achieve, the partners that might be involved, and then how to incentivize those partners rather than trying to apply a cookie cutter approach. I'll just finish up by saying a word about the evaluation itself. So James mentioned that establishing a counterfactual in these projects was really challenging, but we felt that the evaluation report did present the scope and the parameters of the evaluation really clearly, and that it was clear about what this evaluation study could and couldn't tell us. Secondly, we felt that the format of these reports and the supporting materials that James and his team provided were a really major factor in our ability to communicate the findings and to use the findings to inform and influence our future activity, both within the FCDO and externally, thinking about those traffic light ratings that were on one of James's slides, simple things like having a strong executive summary, a good contents page to signpost, additional infographics and detailed case studies. All of that has really meant that we can make the most of this evaluation, both internally and externally. So I'll stop there. Looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Jemima. Thank you, James, for both of you for walking us through the evaluation and key insights. And also it was really interesting to see how FCDO is thinking about these findings and taking it into practice. I see a lot of questions in the chat. I was wondering if I could go to Caroline Finnes first, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question. I know you have quite a lot of questions, so if you can kind of present some questions to Jemima and James, that would be great.
Thank you. Yeah, so I work in philanthropy and so have seen the development and of social impact bonds and now also development impact bonds. I'm really skeptical about them because it seems that they can be an enormous amount of contractual faffing around. And I don't really understand I don't understand kind of what the purpose of them is supposed to be, because social impact bonds, as I understand it, were invented in the UK to solve the problem where one government department has to pay for something, but the benefits would be a cost saving to another department, right? So it might be that you run education. I can't think of an example, but that's, I think, where they were supposed to come from. And I don't understand how that is supposed to translate into the development world. I remember saying this right at the beginning when Toby Eccles and Owen Barder were cooking them up. I don't understand how this is supposed to, the problem doesn't seem to be the same problem at all with like village enterprises work or education in India. So I don't understand what problem they're supposed to be solving. So I'm interested in your views on that. And secondly, I don't really understand this is a really interesting analysis, and I'm really grateful that you all have done it. But the amount of, one argument that people make, I've certainly heard this from Optimus Fund, for example, is that they bring in additional funding. So there's some funders who will provide the capital, if the results are met, who would not otherwise provide that capital. Goldman Sachs is often cited as an example, and I just wondered whether you saw any evidence of that. So firstly, what problem are these things solving? And secondly, given that I can't identify a problem they're solving, are they at least bringing in new money?
I don't know if you want me to go first, Sri. Contractual faffing around. Yeah, I think that's quite a pithy way of saying it. And I agree with you that there was, and that's what I was saying, a lot of the additional cost and time goes into the upfront design of them. I think that, and that is one, arguably, you could say, is one of the negatives of these. And that's why we can debate where they're most appropriate in the future. But that's why I think that as crises response programs, conflict areas, humanitarian, I'm not necessarily convinced that they're right, because you need a lot of time up front to get them right. I would say, though, that contractual faffing around then has benefits in the actual program itself. And that's what I was saying in terms of that first one, that there's actually a very clear articulation of what the thing is trying to achieve, what the outcomes are, and how they're going to be measured. And we didn't see that to the same degree in the similar interventions that we were seeing that weren't done through an impact bond. So it does have a downside in terms of the time and complexity that it brings. And that's why I was saying, can some of that be streamlined? But it does, from what we saw, then lead to benefits as well. What's the purpose of them is a really good
So,
question.
just on that, I'm just into that because, like, an organisation like Village Enterprise, who I know are on, Village Enterprise kind of have their act together about what outcomes they're trying to measure. This sounds like it's more intervention on donor behaviour, getting donors to be focused on provide some pressure on outcomes. But where you have an end, when I act for donors, and so donors can provide that pressure irrespective of the mechanism through which they're funding. And some NGOs like Village Enterprise, and I would wager Educate Girls, kind of have their act together in terms of measuring their outcomes and managing to outcomes. So that's partly why I'm trying to understand what marginal benefit these things really create.
I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, Celeste is in the panel, so I would agree with Village Enterprise. I'll let Celeste answer that. But I would say on QEI, an awful lot of time and debate went into what is going to be measured and how. So it wasn't there, or it was, but not with. It did lead to huge amounts of debate, so it wasn't sorted before the impact bond. In terms of what is their purpose, I think there's two things to consider there. One is what were they hoping to achieve, and therefore what was their purpose believed to be, and then what have they actually achieved, and therefore what do I think their purpose is in the future. And there were many aspirations around what they could achieve in the beginning, which gets onto your third point around additional funding. And I think some of those original purposes have proven to be the case and some haven't. And I think the funding one is the one where there's a large question mark. And actually, one of the impact bonds, the donor said we got into this because we were interested in additional sources of income, working with the private sector, bringing in extra money to the sector. We didn't get that. But what we did get, which we weren't expecting, was a much more rigorous oversight in terms of the performance management and the monitoring and the systems that we got with that, which we've rolled out to our other programs. So some of the things that they were supposed to be doing, the savings, I mean, it's a question mark over whether it's done that in the UK. That was never the intention in terms of the impact bonds for the reasons that you've correctly identified. So some of their original purposes, intentions, when they've been tested against reality, they haven't been there. But that's why I was saying the ones that we saw that can't come out the strongest are around that kind of performance management aspect.
Thanks.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Caroline.
Is it okay if I step in on that question too? Just because the Village Enterprise Impact Bond came up several times. So for the Village Enterprise Impact Bond, we did see considerable value in terms of doing the upfront work with all of the stakeholders to align on what are the outcomes of interest here. And then in the implementation of the project, both having that clarity across stakeholders and also within our teams, but also having the flexibility to iterate on our programming and how we deliver during the project. For us, we found it to be extremely valuable in terms of being able to deliver to the people in the communities the best version of ourselves. That said, though, we walked away from the impact bond really converted to the notion of there's value in using PBR mechanisms, payment by results mechanisms. Not necessarily sold on this is all because of the impact bond model. And so I think for us, we with an impact bond model, at the essence of what you're doing, it's about who you're incentivizing, right? With an impact bond model, you're bringing in and you're incentivizing the investor. In the context, especially of these earlier pilot impact bonds, I think that even if there's not as much financial incentive for the service provider, there was considerable incentive from the perspective of reputational risk. And so I do question, right, is if impact bonds were to scale, would you still have that same performance effect if it's only reputational risk? Because as it just becomes more common, that won't be as big of a deal for service providers. But so as Village Enterprise is thinking about the future, though, we are really keen to continue implementing programming in the context of having at least some payment tied to results. In the context of the alternative being contracting where all payment is tied to activities. Because even for an organization like Village Enterprise, or like any organization that cares about like the end result, even if you truly care about the end result, even if you have great lessons from before, contexts continually change. Like there is an ongoing need to iterate, but if you're implementing a project where you've predefined all of your activities and your main goal is to implement according to those activities and to effectively manage your burn rates, it just makes it extremely difficult to focus on the end goal of, but is this translating into impact? I think Village Enterprise right now, we've been, since we finished the impact bond, we were in conversations with USAID about launching another project. And so we've just launched a follow-on project with USAID in Rwanda. USAID was one of the outcome funders of our impact bond. And it's another PBR, another payment by results project, but it's not an impact bond. In the context of this project, there's payment tied to both activities and outcomes, and so about 20% of the contract is of the payments are tied to outcomes, which from our perspective is we believe, and we'll see as we move on with the project, but we see that as really sort of like sufficient to hopefully give us the same benefits that we saw from the impact bond. Just quickly drawing on an example of one other project that we're working on, though, which is designing a project with Common Good Marketplace, which is an emerging social outcomes marketplace, where in the context of that project, we would sell verified impact assets on the marketplace that are already achieved. And that's a project where Village Enterprise moving into the future would continue to see considerable value in bringing in investment. So essentially using the DIB model, because it's something where it would facilitate scaling for us, and because in the context of the purchasers of the impact assets, there's no interest there in providing any of the earlier capital that would be needed to support our working capital costs. So that's where it would be really attractive for Village Enterprise to continue to use that DIB model. Over.
Thank you so much, Silas. Thank you for coming in and answering the question. And thank you so much to Jemima and James for the presentations. I know we have a very rich discussion coming up for the next part of the session. So I'll hand over to Mara, who will be chairing the panel discussion. Over to you, Mara.
Thank you, Shri. And it's really exciting to follow the conversation taking place in the chat. I wish I could split myself in two and answer and listen at the same time. Please try to post your question and try to answer some of the question, and invite my team to answer the one to which we might have some answers to. So it's my pleasure to chair this panel discussion. We have 5 panelists. We have already heard who James Ronicle is from Ecorys, and Jemima Hodkinson from FCDO. I might give it the microphone for a brief introduction again to Celeste, because you jumped in giving an answer without introducing who you are. So for those who don't know you, if you can say a couple of words about who you are, and then I'll pass it to Milena and Ali. Celeste.
Yes, sorry. So I am the Chief of Impact and Innovative Financing at Village Enterprise.
Thank you. Milena?
Hi, and thank you so much for the great presentation and discussion so far. I'm Milena Castelnou. I'm Chief Programs Officer at the Education Outcomes Fund. I'm also a visiting fellow of practice at the Go Lab. Just to introduce EOF very briefly, we are a hosted fund at UNICEF, and we actually were created to bring to scale outcomes-based financing mechanism, really taking on some of these learnings that James highlighted in his presentation around the importance of launching outcomes funds at scale. And indeed are implementing currently 2 programs with FCDO's funding, and working on the design of several more.
And Ali?
Thank you. And thank you everyone for such a rich discussion already. It's a privilege to be part of this group over here. and add to the conversation. I'm Ali Inam. I'm working as an investment manager with Bridges Outcomes Partnerships. Bridges manages pooled funds from investors with the mandate of supporting outcome-based contracting. We've done that for over 10 years in the UK, and more recently have established a partnership with UBS Optimus Foundation to extend that support to international contracts or DIBs. And currently I'm leading on investments in Sierra Leone and Ghana, which are supported by EOF.
Thank you. And are we spotlighting Jemima as well for this conversation? Great. So I'll structure the panel discussion around 3 themes. One, as Julie said at the beginning, the first theme is around the value added of the DIB model. And there is a lot of conversation happening in the chat. Is it really valuable? Are the costs worth the benefit? Once you've done a DIB, you ditch it and you do something else instead. And I will spend about 10 minutes on this question, going back to our panelists, and then we'll move on the role of the various stakeholders that have been covered in this evaluation, and a clear understanding of what role they play and the tension and difficulties of the collaboration and peer learning. And then we'll move more at the long-term sustainability, wider effect. So the so what question, like what's next? So I might come to you, Celeste, again, to pick up the conversation we were provoked on by Caroline on when is the DIB model offering better value. So, and where it couldn't, like village enterprise might consider to be engaged in a DIB in some cases and stay away from it in others. So can you summarize for us when you're interested in a DIB compared to a PBR, compared to something else entirely? And maybe then I come to you, James. You've been evaluating a number of DIBs, both in Africa and, well, worldwide. So I'll draw on your expertise there. Celeste.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real value proposition of an impact bond approach to PBR is that you're transferring risk to the investor. Most traditionally, we think that of it is the performance risk. But often there's other risks as well that are being transferred to the investor. Sometimes because that risk is transferred to the investor, we also see additional benefits, like the investor coming in to provide capacity development for the service providers, but not always, right? Because it depends on if the service provider needs that, if the investor has the capacity to provide that, and so forth. So I think that there's a couple scenarios that where I primarily see a continued like real value add for impact bonds, and that case of transferring risk to the investor moving forward. One is the context of organizations like the World Bank is. Some teams within the World Bank come to mind where they're specifically supposed to be focused on how can we innovatively leverage private-public partnership to for better development outcomes. And so there's like that real tie, right, between the value proposition of incentivizing the private sector and what those teams are mandated to be working on. I think that there's also the scenario I was referencing a couple of minutes ago in regards to social outcomes markets. And there, the buyer, I think like the theoretical future buyer is probably agnostic to how the funding is, how programming is funded. But in that case, the service provider would have an incentive to incentivize and to transfer some risk to the investor. And then, I think those are sort of like two concrete examples I would draw on, but I think like at the heart of the matter is there has to be the alignment between that value add of transferring the risk to the investor and the priorities and the mandates of the funder and the service provider.
Thank you, Celeste. Can I come to you, James? You were mentioning in the presentation before differences in DIB effect across the different models. So what is this variety of the DIB effect?
Yeah, thank you. And I might answer that question and try and cover off the question about the humanitarian impact bond at the same time, because I think it perhaps says the same thing, where for me, as hopefully I got across in the presentation, where I see the value proposition is that that increased focus on outcomes, and everybody does care about outcomes, and they always care about outcomes, but it's also easy to get distracted and they become overlooked. Donors or commissioners often can get more focus on the distribution of funds. Politician makes a great announcement, moves on to the next thing. Is there much follow-up around whether that announcement actually occurred or not? Equally, service providers can get very focused on delivery and then fundraising, which is often about claiming all of the things that were done, but is there always a sort of strong focus and analysis of what actually was done? And by what I see often in the impact bonds is by clearly defining success up front, by putting an articulation on it, making it very clear how it's going to be measured and putting a price on it, and then putting that risk of failure around it, it makes everybody, they don't care more about it, they always cared about it, but it makes them focus much more on it, and it makes them worry about it more, and therefore they change things more when they don't see those outcomes happening. That's where I see the key benefit. And you don't always see that. And someone's asking about the ICRC here. I'm happy to put the case study, and I quickly read whilst we were talking, what did we say the benefits of the ICRC HIB were? And I'll put it in the I'll put the case study in the chat. But the ICRC HIB case study is quite complicated in its conclusions, and it's saying, well, there are some benefits that came out as a result of this. The Red Cross introduced some new mechanisms. Did they need an impact bond to do that? Not really. Could a grant have achieved the same thing? Probably. So why didn't you see it as much? This is what I said earlier. Why didn't you see it as much in the ICRC humanitarian impact bond? And it's because that ability to change and adapt, like you already had a program that was doing very, very well. It's been running for years. The ICRC know how to do physical rehabilitation centers. So could you massively increase the outcomes? Not really, because it was already working really well. They already had really established processes in place. So are you going to get an increased focus on outcomes and increased change management? Not really. And you didn't really see it. So there was definite, and that's why I think they're more appropriate, as I said, in places where you think outcomes could be better, where you think you need a bit of a disruption to change things. So I think that's why you do see a difference. You don't always see that effect, but that's where it is. That's where I think the strongest effect in them is.
Thank you, James. I want to bring us back to some of the recommendations you made in the evaluation, and I'll go in order. I will ask Celeste, Milena, and Ali to reflect on what are their reaction to this recommendation. And I will remind them for our audience here, among the suggestions you say, oh, it would be helpful to streamline the model. We said this evaluation is not deep work, don't work, but in which circumstances might be helpful and how can you build on the strength and the benefits of this approach and reduce the costs. And your recommendation with this in respect to this are helpful to design outcome funds to create economies of scale, taking a model agnostic approach, so keeping the focus of outcome, like we were saying just now, but allowing the form of this outcome approach to vary depending on the particular context. 3, maybe look at the organization level scaling rather than scaling the deep. So are there spillover within the organization? So we are changing ways of working within. Is that the way to go? And reducing the reliance on external expertise and intermediaries as the sector matures. And lastly, experimenting with an easier way to bring philanthropic funds and government funds together. So those were your highlights. And so I'm coming to you, Celeste, in terms of your reaction when you read the report. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Any reasons for agreeing with some and not others? So Celeste.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the second recommendation around the model agnostic approach really sits well with me. Primarily going back to what I mentioned earlier around Village Enterprise walked away from our impact bond really, really is evangelists to this notion that, wow, PBR, payment by results, instead of payment for activities is way better. But we think that the model, right, like whether it's an impact bond or whether it's a milestone-based however you set that up, we shouldn't right now say this way is better or that way is better. It really depends on the context and the funders, and it depends on a whole host of factors. I think the other thing that in addition to the recommendations that I saw in the report, one thing that I would add as a recommendation for scaling up a use of PBR is just that I think it's really critical. A lot of the solutions that we've seen in the field really sort of relate to bringing in like third parties, like an outcomes fund is really bringing in a third party, right, to facilitate scaling. But I guess for myself, I would like to see a future where and so I'm American, so I think a lot about USAID, but where, like at USAID, it's more of a practice, like this tying funding, at least some funding, to results is more like the norm. And it's like, if you're not tying funding, at least some of your funding, to results, like you need to get a waiver for that, right? Like there needs to be an explanation why, in the context of these projects where they are intended to achieve results, we're not tying at least some funding to those results. That there needs to be an explanation for that. And so in the context of that being my vision of like what scale would really look like, I think it's really, really important that we focus efforts on figuring out how can we work with these large, bilateral, multilateral institutions that are responsible for so much development assistance. Within the structures that work for them, what are the effective ways that we can train their staff to use payment by results mechanisms?
Thank you, Celeste. Milena.
Thank you. Right, I think, to start with, I would say that the first two recommendations absolutely, resonate with the EOF in the sense that this is exactly the way we've also built our model. And actually, EOF was created around the same time as FCDO was experimenting with the DIB pilot program. And so as we established our model, we also were trying to learn from what was happening in the field. And so it's great to see that actually we reached similar conclusions to James around the relevance of actually going to scale and establishing more agnostic models. And so the way we work is that we always try to launch large-scale programs so that we get a lot more, cost efficiency in terms of the design and implementation cost of these, but also establish replicable models that we can replicate in countries at a much lower cost. And so that's regarding the first recommendation. And on the second one, we actually, when we select our partners to implement programs, we are agnostic as to whether or not there needs to be investor support. So in our program in Sierra Leone, for instance, we have some providers partnering with investors, including Bridges Outcomes Partnership, but some other providers self-financing. And so leaving it open to whatever setup is most appropriate for them. On the third one, I think it's a really interesting one, and also fully agree. I think there's different pathways to sustainability, and we had really interesting conversations at the Social Outcomes Conference on this, so I don't want to go into too much details right now. But just to say, I think there can be cases where the long-term benefits are centered around scaling up a new modality of partnerships for public purpose that are aligned on results and centered on outcomes. And in other setups, actually, the scale up of the intervention is what would make more sense in terms of the sustainability pathway. Now, I just wanted to unpack a little bit more the fourth recommendation, because I think that's a really interesting one. Because on one end, I fully agree that there is a need for simplification of the model, and that perhaps we don't always need an impact bond, and there can be other payment for results modality that can achieve the same purpose. But I guess I have here maybe a word of caution, is that I think when the value add of actually having the investor is to also allow us to transfer more risk and to pay almost close to 100% or as much as we can for the outcomes. If we look at a model where we have a much larger portion of the payment on the activities, then we need to make sure that this is not going to limit the flexibility that the providers will have during the implementation. Because what's really, also underlying this kind of ability to course correct that James and Jemima and Celeste have mentioned is the possibility for providers to change course, to look at the data they're collecting and adapt their intervention. A lot of PBR models can sometimes have the worst of both worlds, right? If you're very prescriptive on the activities, but also pay for outcomes, then the providers don't have the ability to achieve these outcomes. And so I think that's something to keep in mind when we think about what is the best instrument. And related to that, I actually had something that maybe is a bit of a controversial question for James, because you were mentioning before that you saw a kind of somehow a much stronger DIB effect in the QEI India and Village Enterprise DIB than on the Humanitarian Impact Bond and the Cataract Fund. And I'm wondering to what extent this is also linked to the fact that both of these, the Village Enterprise and Quality Education India DIB, were a lot more focused on the outcomes, on the impact that these programs were trying to achieve, whereas the Cataract DIB and the Humanitarian Impact Bonds were looking often at more output measures and had perhaps less room for adaptation and kind of really seeing the flexibility completely play out. And I'm not sure if from these case studies we can get to these conclusions, but just wanted to make sure we don't forget about that, the importance of flexibility and the value of focusing on outcomes in that context.
Thank you, Milena. I see you, Ali, nodding on this. Ali, we talk a great deal about the investors and what is in it for them. Do they bear the risk? What is your reaction to the report?
Thank you for engaging me with this. I think perhaps I'll pick from some of the questions that Caroline was raising earlier to highlight that why we think the structure is important for the international context as well. And we feel that outcomes contracts work in a setting when policy issues require personalized solutions, and that links to the point that Milena was raising as well. And the personalized solutions need to be developed for each unit of focus. Now, that can be a student or a school or a health institution, but it requires some careful consideration of how to achieve outcome for that unit of focus. And then the other point that we consider begs the need for an outcomes contract is when there is a need for different stakeholders to come together and work collaboratively towards a common outcome. Now, in the case of Sierra Leone and Ghana, taking the unit of focus to be a school where we are working, we have a singular focus of achieving outcomes that are geared towards improving learning gains for the students that we are working with. And every day, we are having sleepless nights to ensure what can we do, and we do not have a prescribed set of activities. We can innovate on different sets of activities, and we are just trying to really work collaboratively with our service partners to ensure that we are very flexible in our approach to delivery to really push the needle on the final learning gains that we have to achieve. Now, what that leads to is sometimes very difficult conversations. They may be difficult conversations with the commissioners, they may be difficult conversations with the service partners, but those difficult conversations are happening. And we value that structure that outcomes contract has enabled for those difficult conversations to take place on a singular topic, that is the outcomes for the students that we have to achieve. And I think that is really the key dynamic that the outcome contracts enable for all different stakeholders to come together and push the needle in very tough implementation contexts of the low-income countries. Now, linking that to the conversations and the recommendations from James, a lot of them resonate with us as well. And how we think about it is that there is a clear benefit that outcomes contracts bring to the market, but there are several barriers that are hindering their scale up. And we think about those barriers in 4 themes. And we feel like if we are able to address those barriers, then those conversations around complexity would become easier. But those barriers are also a nature of a new product. And are a nature of an innovation premium that a cutting edge product would bring to the market. And that's why some of the initial conversations are perhaps more complicated and more difficult than some of these traditional financing models, which have been happening for some time, and the conversations are a bit more evolved. So those 4 barriers are: one, it is around budget and procurement. Now, budgets are usually designed for a predictable spend, and typically the planning is to spend within a year. As opposed to that, an outcomes partnerships typically requires multi-year investment with a more uncertain payment profile. Now, that creates an uncertainty and complexity that requires a lot of upfront conversations in contracting to understand how that would take place. But that, again, we feel is some of these early conversations, and that aligns with the recommendations that James was having, that once we resolve these issues for one sector, then follow-on conversations would be a lot easier for us to handle. The second bucket of hurdle, the second theme that we define as hurdle is around data management and availability. Now, data collection and analysis is at the core of an outcomes-based partnership. However, many traditional approaches of human services has not really required very rigorous data collection on outcomes. And that is why when we start an outcomes contract in a new sector, that creates that, again, an innovation premium of having very rigorous conversations on what data needs to be collected to measure those outcomes. And that creates a degree of complexity upfront. But again, if we figure that out and we are able to have those tough conversations, it would lead to more simpler means of having outcomes contracts in future. The third is around knowledge and understanding. Now, there are still many decision makers in government, amongst ourselves as well, who are still trying to understand how outcomes partnerships can best be adapted to an international context. And the general notion is that they seem expensive and risky. However, our understanding is that they are perhaps not all the very different from traditional input-based financing. And I will draw the attention to one of the studies that I'm just posting in the chat right now, again, published on the GoLab website, that brings out the details of what are the different costs that an outcomes contract entails, and brings that comparison out a bit more clearly to elicit that sometimes maybe the costs associated with outcomes contract are not so different with costs associated with other forms of contracting. And then the final hurdle is around political dynamics around contracting for outcomes. Now, again, this is a new topic, and the politics around it need to be managed as well, where sometimes, again, with the uncertainty of outcomes that can be achieved, having a political messaging around an outcomes contract can be a lot harder than a bit more input focused.
Thank you, Ali. I'll stop you here because I'm really pressed to move on with our conversation, and I can't believe it's already 1:15. So I suggest I'll come to you, James, to bring us on the role of the stakeholders, and in particular on the collaboration and peer learning across stakeholders. You mentioned that there was a nuance in your report. So can I ask you to reflect on how the different stakeholders play different roles in the different DIBs and how this collaboration varied across the project? And then I'll move us along on the more like long-term impacts before closing.
Yeah, happy to. And I think we've seen this across the across our research on impact bonds, that often, and as you know through your report around collaboration, innovation, and prevention, that collaboration is often seen as one of the great benefits of impact bonds. And I think the answer to that is nuanced. That I definitely think is true, that what they do is they bring different actors together that often don't usually work together in this way. So you've got the outcome payers, you've got the providers, and you've got the investors as well. And you usually have some intermediaries in the middle trying to sort it all out. And that does bring overall benefits in terms of people having different not more money overall, but different types of money that they can use in different ways and different attitudes to risk. And so by bringing all of those different types of funding together and different expertise together, I do think that you result in different types of interventions in different places than if you didn't bring them together. But it is difficult, or it can be difficult. And I'm happy to put more case studies in the chat of where, because those different organizations have different ways of operating, different cultures and different attitudes and different styles as well. So bringing them together can be healthy, but when things aren't going well, it can make things really, really difficult in two ways. One, they don't always agree on the best way to respond to a problem. And there can be quite high levels of tensions within that relationship. But also, I think what we saw, as I said, in some of these impact bonds is that there was, I think because they were risky and because everybody was interested in them, there were lots of stakeholders. So you didn't just have one outcome payer in some, you had 4. You didn't just have one investor in some of them, you had 9. So how do you make a decision on your outcome payments when you've got 4 outcome payers? If you want to renegotiate the terms of the investor, how do you do that when you've got 9 investors? So I think, as I said, the collaboration has benefits, but it can be quite complicated. So I think thinking about, and maybe Milena can come in because I know that they've sort of set out very clearly up front in the contract what can be renegotiated and what can't, to try and sort of control some of the sort of potential of the stakeholder conversations going off in different directions. So it's a bit nuanced, I would say.
Thank you, James. And I think James' comments reflect not just this evaluation, but Ecorys has been evaluating 45 impact bonds to date across 4 countries. So it's a lot of expertise there. Milena, do you want to add a quick comments on what is up for negotiation and what is not in the EOF?
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's an important point to recognize that we're transferring the performance risk to the providers and investors. But the question that we should ask ourselves is, what risk are we actually comfortable transferring? And recognizing that, throughout the course of these programs, a lot of things can happen. So I think it's really important to define upfront, where is there going to be room for negotiation? And we call these the significant events that could lead to all parties coming around the table and agreeing to making changes to the design. But there are also some foreseeable events that we can try to anticipate. And in which case we say, if this happens, then we will adjust the contract in that way to facilitate the process. Because in all of our programs, we do have several implementers, some of them with investors, several outcome funders also that are supporting the program with their funding, etc. So in order to facilitate a little bit that process, trying to define upfront what is going to be up for negotiation, and because we know that life happens, the COVID pandemic, no one could have planned for it. But on the other hand, what can we already be thoughtful around in terms of potential adjustments to the mechanisms?
Thank you, Milena. I want to move us along a little bit and go beyond this particular like the time of a particular project, a pilot or an evaluation, and think about what happens after. What are the wider system implications, the long-term effect, or the system strengthening? Sometimes we talk of working in this way, if any. So maybe I come to you, Celeste, first, because you've been reflecting as an implementer on how the model helped or didn't beyond this particular experience. What's happening in Village Enterprise? What were the learning for the wider organization and in the system you operate?
Yeah, and so we actually did an internal analysis with our internal monitoring and evaluation data because we implement a model. So we were implementing the impact under the impact bond, but we were also implementing the same model in other areas at the same time and continue to implement the same model with ongoing iterations for context and so forth. And so it was really interesting. So in our early analysis, looking at just like the first couple of cohorts in the impact bond that we worked with, we right away we saw higher impact in looking at like pre-post surveys, right? Higher impact in the impact bond cohorts compared to our other programming. But one of the things that Village Enterprise intentionally did is we focused our innovation first within the impact bond. And then we scaled it out to the rest of our organization. At the time, we really had the flexibility to do this because a lot of our other programming was through unrestricted funding. And so with unrestricted funding, you have that same flexibility that you have with an impact bond, right? Where you can make a change. You don't need to get permission from a donor. And so in subsequent cohorts, what we saw was like this increased impact that we saw in the earlier cohorts in the impact bond. We saw that go away. So our interpretation was, wow, this was great. We had these fantastic spillover effects of the impact bond where we saw improvement, we rolled it out, and then we saw improvement everywhere. The one area where we didn't see the rest of programming catch up was with the small proportion of businesses that are still red businesses at the end of the program. There was something different in the impact bond where staff just like went that extra mile, and there was still at the end like a smaller proportion of red businesses in the impact bond areas. And so that for us was a really encouraging story around, you can take these learnings, you can improve, sort of have them affect your entire organization, but with the caveat that, it matters how the rest of your organization is funded. At the time, like with the unrestricted funding, I think that was really key to making it possible for those improvements to have take up across the organization. We are just getting ready now. Later this month, we'll start 5-year follow-up data collection for our first 2 cohorts of the impact bond. And so we, by the spring, we'll be able to, we should have results looking back in to see, okay, so 5 years later, what are we seeing? Did that difference that we initially saw, does that hold? So we'll look forward to sharing those results later. Over.
Thank you, Celeste. We look forward to reading them. And we are almost at time. So I suggest using the last few minutes to do a quick fire among our panelists in terms of the top takeaway. So what will you be doing differently after having read this evaluation? What is your top change? I might start with Jemima. I'm sure you commissioned the evaluation. You spent time thinking, what have I learned, how I implement it? Then I'll come to you, Milena. You're already implementing some of the changes from previous waves of this evaluation. Ali, Celeste, and then James, if you want to wrap up, what is the legacy, in one word, from your work on this evaluation and others? Jemima?
Sure, I'll kick us off. So I've talked a bit about some of the ways that we've applied some of the very practical recommendations from the evaluation, but what we're really reflecting on now is how we go to teams around our organization and try to do that organization level scaling of the outcomes focused approach. And as I mentioned before, really thinking and getting people to think in a model agnostic way, think critically and creatively about what outcomes you're trying to achieve, what elements are required to do that, and how to construct incentives to make that happen.
Thank you, Jemima. Milena?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been really fascinating. I think we definitely always look for other kind of information around evaluation pieces around what has been working and not so working so well in other programs, and in our own programs also trying to get the lessons learned so we inform the design of the next kind of wave. But I think really the point that I would take away from all this is really this importance of scale, and that for us remains critical in order to be able to get the model to deliver its potential in a more cost-effective way. And I think that we should also try to see, I mean, it was a deep pilot program, right? The evaluation has shown the huge potential that these programs can have, these models can have. And I really hope that now we move to a stage when more and more funders can actually move to looking at scaling rather than doing their own pilot programs. So just very much hoping that these findings are going to be taken on board by others in the sector.
Thank you. Arlen, coming to you, and I'm drawing attention to Celeste. There are a couple of questions on the service provider and how flexible. So if you can wave an answer in your closing, it would be great. Ali.
Yes, thank you. Very quickly, I think from our perspective, we would be looking into the designing around economies of scale and how can we contribute to the learnings from the existing lessons so that the future designs are simpler. And then around the reliance on intermediaries of how what role can we play as a more involved investor or supporter of service partners to support more efficient delivery on the ground.
Thank you, Ali. Celeste, I know you asked an impossible question. You have 30 seconds to answer three things.
Okay, so I think that in terms of the report, one thing that I'll touch on that we haven't spoken about as much is evaluation. But there is, I think we can. We all recognize that there are barriers in evaluation for measurement is a barrier to impact bonds. And so this is something where, and I think, sorry, I think that's the question, right, Elias? I think I already lost my 30 seconds, sorry. The flexibility related to, okay, so I'm just going to assume I understand the question, where it's this trade-off, right? Like you're either focusing on your end outcomes and you're needing to do like an RCT, and that's a barrier to these projects for some reason, or you're focusing on more proximate outcomes, and then that's a barrier because you don't have as much flexibility to innovate and so forth. I think that this is it's something that we need to, it is an issue for the scaling of impact bonds. I think that one of the things that Village Enterprise is working on right now is working on, is there a situation where we can make it possible to focus on those end outcomes without needing to do RCT after RCT after RCT? And so one of the things that we're doing right now is we're working on putting together a collaboration of practitioners and academics to look at, can we use big data? And in our first research question, can we use artificial intelligence? Can we use satellite imagery, perhaps some night lights to predict poverty and to actually evaluate impact rather than doing traditional impact evaluation?
Thank you, Celeste. That was a wonderful synthesis. And James, you want to give a final word?
Thank you. I'll try and keep it brief. Jemima sort of set up the introduction to this whole session on one of the big important parts of the DIBs pilot program was to test them and was to build the evidence and to understand what they do. And I hope that we sort of played our part in contributing to that. And I hope that some of the findings have come across today. The evaluation was incredibly interesting. It did have limitations, and I kind of wish it didn't, because it would make the debate so much easier if we just had really clear answers, but we don't. So I think the debate will always carry on. I've been following the chat. There is a lot of sort of questions, a lot of sort of highlights of their limitations, and I would agree with all of them. And I'm not saying now we've got the answer and, okay, we know what they do, let's go and roll them out exactly as they are. I think refinement and more thinking and more experimentation is needed. But I do think there is something in the mechanism and the way that it's done and the way that it sort of focuses on outcomes. I do think there's something there, and I do think it's something that sort of helps implementation and helps delivery.
Thank you, James. And thank you to our wonderful panelists for the presentation and for this discussion, and to all of you who posted very challenging questions throughout the session. The session will be recorded if you want to listen to it again or share with your colleagues. So thank you for now, and stay tuned for our next Engaging with Evidence session.